Hi everyone, welcome to my Virtual 18 presentation, Vocabulary Victories. My name is Dr. Katie Tupple, and I'm a K-5 English Language Development Specialist. I'm also an adjunct professor at Portland State University, and I teach courses in their ESOL endorsement series. I'm really excited to share with you some of the activities and strategies and games that I've been using this school year for vocabulary instruction. To give you a little background context, the district I work in has an adopted reading program, which is Journeys, and I am supporting students in their reading blocks. I'm supporting the approaching reading groups, so students who are not meeting grade level expectations. And many of the students in the groups are ELL students. So I have developed kind of a variety of strategies that I will use throughout the week in order to support them in learning the 10 vocabulary words. There's 8 to 10 vocabulary words that go along with their lesson, which encompasses a theme and a main selection text for the week. My district has an explicit vocabulary routine. There's 4 steps, and this is a routine that all teachers are expected to utilize for vocabulary instruction as part of our core reading program. So the 4 steps are listed here, and for me, this routine is a great jumping off point. I understand the need for explicit instruction, and I also understand the need for common routines or common instructional practices so that students know what to expect in classrooms. However, I also think it's really important, and we all know this, to remember that we need to teach the students who are in front of us. One size does not fit all. So while this instructional routine is a solid routine for vocabulary instruction, there's nothing wrong with it, I enhance it a lot. So this is my starting off point, and then I incorporate a lot of other activities throughout the week so that my students can really interact and engage with the vocabulary words. I emphasize connections and critical thinking, because I don't want them just memorizing these 10 words and then forgetting them. I want them really developing skills to interact and understand and deepen the contextualization of the words that they're learning. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I'm an avid reader, and I love to read books that help me know strategies that I can use with English learners and just how to be a better teacher for English learners. A couple of the resources that I've used that have given me an idea of the extent of the depth to which I want to incorporate in my vocabulary routine are Bringing Words to Life. And on the next slide, there's some additional steps from Robert Marzano. Shout out to Beatrice, to B. Lopez, who created this cool visual, highlighting the 6 steps that are introduced in Bringing Words to Life. I don't want to go too much in detail in explaining about these steps. That's a great resource. I recommend everybody read it. But the main point is that in addition to directly teaching the meaning of words, we need to give students many different opportunities to engage with these words. And the authors of Bringing Words to Life say in thought-provoking, playful, and interactive ways. And so I've drawn from these steps, as well as the steps from Marzano, which are on this slide, in order to create this repertoire and this variety of activities that I do throughout the week. Marzano mentions that we should be describing and explaining rather than defining words. We should be having students discussing words and playing games, and also using non-linguistic representations. So all of these teaching texts have given me ideas for activities that I use with my students. The reason the co-build primary learners dictionary is pictured there is because I utilize that to help my students understand the meaning of words. Oftentimes the definitions that are provided in the reading curriculum include words that also would be vocabulary words for English learners. So you're defining a word they don't know with the word they don't know. That doesn't work for English learners. So my perspective is that teaching vocabulary to students who are native English speakers is one thing. Teaching vocabulary to students who are acquiring English and perhaps are newcomers, very new to the language, you need to incorporate elements to make this vocabulary comprehensible and make it understandable and kind of make it come to life for students so they can really understand it. One of the great texts we've read for ELL Chat Book Club is Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And one of the reasons I love Zaretta Hammond's work is because she says you cannot dispute neuroscience. You cannot dispute how the brain biologically functions. And one of the things that we know is that the brain responds to stories. So in an article that Zaretta Hammond put out, she talks about 3 ways to make any lesson culturally responsive. One is to storify, another is to gamify. And so an idea that I had was to take the vocabulary words that come from the reading curriculum and put them into a story about my students. So I started writing these stories that feature my students, and I created little puppets or little characters with their faces, just for their privacy purposes. I've covered their faces with emojis. I wish you could really see them. But I've given them each a character, and then I incorporate my students' names into a story that I've written, and I incorporate the vocabulary words. This is the first thing I will do before I formally introduce the words. So I create a page document for each word that includes the word, the description, some visuals, and then sometimes synonyms or sometimes a sentence frame. And I pass those out. I then read the story to students. They gather in front of me on the carpet, and I read the story that I've written to the students. And every time we get to a vocabulary word, I say, okay, who has that word? And then they proceed to read the definition, and I hold up their puppet and their character. Their character has an image on the popsicle stick on their photo that relates to that word. And so that's their first interaction with the word, is hearing a story that they're in. And students tend to really remember the details of these stories. For example, this one, we decide that we're going to go on a hike, and 2, even though I say that they need to wear proper clothing, 2 of the students ignore me. And so their characters, which are different than the ones pictured here, this story does not match these particular words. In that story, when they ignored, their little characters had earphones or something covering their ears to symbolize that they were ignoring me. And so that's just a visual cue, and they really respond to being in the story. They look forward to these stories. I've kind of gone with a premise of my students encounter this magic portal and they get transported to all these different places. And that allows me to put my students in the setting of the stories that they read. So they've been to Antarctica, they've been on the prairie, they've been to a volcano, and then most recently they've been to Mount Everest. So I put them in the setting of the story and have them interacting with these words, and them being the ones that use the words or are described with the words. And just like Zaretta Hammond says, I'm just storifying it for them because it's about them. So they tend to remember it and like that. And it's kind of a nice way to first introduce the words before I go into the formal explicit instruction routine where I introduce the word and we clap the syllables and do the district expectations. Something else that I've started to do is to have students, as Marzano recommended, do a non-linguistic representation. So as I'm introducing the words formally with the instructional routine, students are able to open up their notebooks and sketch. So as you can see in this picture, the top right, one of our vocabulary words was sketch. And so we talked about what a sketch is. And students are able to sketch a little picture or image that corresponds with the word. That helps them to think about it. So rather than looking at my document, which has a photograph that they might look at and might not really truly process, them drawing the word just adds another layer of them thinking about it and what it means, and maybe putting it into a context that's meaningful to them. These pictures are by one of my students who happens to be an extremely talented artist. I always love to see her drawings. Not everyone does the drawings to this detail and to this great extent, but it's them kind of putting their own thoughts into it. So, for example, in this picture, Fernanda's imagining a pumpkin and a dog, and it looks like a unicorn. And for somebody else, their imagine might be something totally different depending on what they're passionate about or what they like. So these non-linguistic representations are just another layer for students to solidify what the words mean. Throughout the week, I also draw images myself. You'll see on some of the next slides. And I also have students involved in drawing a picture scene that incorporates all the vocabulary words. And so incorporating these visual images is something that I've started to do that students like to do and they relate to. Another element is that total physical response. So for every word that we have, we pair it with emotion. This past week was about Mount Everest and mountain climbing. So one of the words was approaching. So we put our hand out, put our fist here, and then we brought it closer, and we constantly said approaching. Every time we do the motion, we say approaching. Then we had avalanche. So we made the snow falling. Avalanche, avalanche. As we were approaching the peak of the mountain, we came across an avalanche. Then we had to halt. So every word is paired with emotion, and we're constantly saying that word in conjunction with the motion to help our brain remember. That's another piece of brain research, that the more avenues we use to learn something, the better we'll remember it. So that physical body movement paired with saying the word gives us more neural pathways to remember it. So we sometimes do a charades activity where I say, I'll have a student get up and look at a word and have them show the motion, and everyone else has to say the word. Or I'll just say, show me approaching, and they'll go approaching. Show me avalanche, avalanche. Show me halt, halt. So we're constantly saying the word and pairing it with that motion, because it's a go-to strategy for English learners is make it physical, give them movement. Opportunities to move are always appreciated by students. And it's just making more neural pathways. We recently got 2 newcomers who both happen to be Spanish speakers. And so I started to use cognates and introduce them to the words in Spanish as well as English. One, so that they can have this kind of meta-linguistic awareness to know that sometimes a word that they see in English looks virtually identical to the word that they already know in Spanish. And oftentimes there isn't a cognate. The words don't look exactly the same, but I also find it helpful to tell them a similar word or what the word means in Spanish, just so they understand. And I also pair it with a visual, because what I really want is for them to be remembering the concept, but then also pairing it with the word in English. So I am introducing these words in their native language, but I'm not ending there. I'm really stretching them to make sure that they're still using the target word in English. And I literally experienced my newcomers going from not saying anything in my group to passively sitting there to having them completely engaged, bubbling with ideas, idea after idea after idea. Yes, they are speaking to me in their native language, but they're engaged. And I don't always understand them, but I can ask them, can you slow down? I can use it as a teaching and learning experience. Just as I need to speak slower for you when I'm speaking in English, I need you to speak slower for me when you speak in Spanish so I can understand. Because I'm not that great at Spanish. I'm learning it. They teach me words and I teach them words. And when you can teach your teacher something, that gives you this sense of value. And I think that they really appreciate that. And I love to see them actively engaged. We had the word twist, and one of my newcomers talked about twisting spaghetti, and then she talked about the clothes twisting in the washing machine. She had so many examples because she was allowed to utilize her native language. So that's a gift. Let them use it, bring it in where they can, but still make those connections to the pictures, which are universal, and then also the target language. So when I'm using this chart, I'm going back to the gestures that we've created together. So for twist, we made a twisting motion. For guide, we pretended we had a microphone, and then we did kind of this sweeping motion of I'm showing you the way, I'm guiding you. For lava, we made the explosion. So we're constantly then pairing those motions that we did before with the target words, so that even if they don't understand everything I'm saying, they can relate the gesture to the picture to the keyword that I want them to learn. I've also started using these picture scenes. One day we started to, and I got this idea from the ELL Teacher's Toolbox, from the section on the inductive learning. And I don't feel that this is exactly the PWIM strategy, but I got the idea from the PWIM strategy. So essentially we create a scene together. I was drawing and they were drawing on their papers. And then we figured out what to add to our scene that would represent our vocabulary words. I since went back and redrew my picture to make it a little neater. But what's really neat, what's really interesting is that the helicopter in the picture on the left was an idea that came from the student. The word was arrival. And it was easy to illustrate lava and to illustrate the anchor and to illustrate the person spotting something. Arrival was trickier, and my student came up with it. And so how validating that her idea went on our class chart with the word arrival. it was a great way to bring in students' creative thinking and to have their ideas represented. And then I did redraw it, and I added the Post-it notes with the vocabulary words to then make it an interactive opportunity where students can place the words where they belong in the picture. So then this was a task for them, like the picture on the right with the mountain climber. I said, okay, which climber represents halt? And the student had to place the sticky note on the correct climber and then explain why. So there's a lot of elements at play here. It's tactile, it's visual, it's verbal, because students are having to explain how the piece of the picture relates to the vocabulary concept. It might be hard to see, but the climber that is climbing the mountain has a thought bubble, and it shows the little stick figure at the top of the mountain with a check mark in a box, and that represents succeed, because that was his goal, was to get to the top, and he's imagining himself there, and so that represents succeed. And so giving students the opportunity to explain that and to show that that is the part of the picture that goes with succeed, because was really fun. And then I've used it in small group where we're talking about it all together. I've used it where we are actually drawing the picture together and labeling it. And then I used it as an independent activity after a student finished a close exercise. I said, okay, go over to the chart and show me where all the words go. And then I checked in and had this student explain why. So Word Nerds is another great source or resource about vocabulary instruction. And it talks about how multisensory activities can really help students to internalize the word. So I feel this is a really great example of a multisensory activity because, as I mentioned, it's incorporating so many different elements. It's the tactile, it's the visual, it's the creative thinking. There's so much to it. And students really, really enjoyed it. It's a great way also to demonstrate how these words fit together, because they are paired in a particular lesson with a particular theme for a reason, because they are related. And so this is a good foundation for then some of the activities we do later in the week where I'm asking students to connect words based on their meanings. This great concept comes from Building Literacy with English Language Learners, a really interesting text. I learned these words. These were vocabulary words for me: lemma and lexeme. So the lemma is the single form of a word, and then the lexeme is the set of variations that are created when you add different morphemes. So rather than just teaching a suffix or a prefix in isolation, we combine them with the weekly vocabulary words. So if our word is twitch, very odd word, but if our word is twitch, what other words, what variations can we make? We can make twitching, twitcher, twitched, twitches. And we can talk about why some prefixes or suffixes don't go with that word where others do. And in making these variations, we are reiterating and practicing the meaning of those prefixes and suffixes. So if we add ing, well, what does that mean? Ing means it's happening right now. And then we talk about how if we use that ing, typically we would see the word is or the word was prior to that verb twitching, because it's happening right now. He is twitching. He was twitching. And so it helps students understand kind of contextual words or clues to look for in reference to those specific suffixes. And it helps them learn prefixes and suffixes in the context of the words that we are already practicing. I've also done this a different way with putting the suffix in the center. We did the suffix able, and then students had to come up with other words that had that. And so this particular graphic could be used in a variety of ways, depending on if you want to focus on the actual base word and its meaning with variations, or if you really want to focus on that particular prefix or suffix and then words that have it. So it's flexible. I basically printed this visual and laminated it so that students could use dry erase markers and we could write on them and then take them down. So in conjunction with learning the word list for the week, we're also creating these variation lists so that we know other ways we could use it in a sentence. Because when we go to play the dice game, students are not just using the word as it appears in the anchor text. They might need a variation to make it fit in their idea with their own context. So knowing the variations is very important. So when it comes to learning words, we don't want to teach just the lemma. We want to teach that lexeme, that set of variations, so students become familiar. They don't just learn a word, they learn an entire set. My dice game is a game that I love. I can't even remember where I got the idea, but I have used this game so much with my third graders and my fourth graders. Essentially, I take the word list, I put it into this grid, and each vocabulary word has a particular number. Students roll the dice, and then depending on what number they get, they have to use that word in a sentence. There's feedback built in. So I have this game, I have partners play the game. They take turns rolling the dice, and then the partner will give feedback when they hear their partner's sentence. And they can say either, nice job using the word in a sentence, or I don't think you used the word correctly, try again. I've also added a third one, nice job using the prefix with the word or nice job using the suffix with the word so that they can practice recognizing prefixes and suffixes as they're used if their partner happens to use a variation. This strategy was featured in the ELL Teacher's Toolbox, referred to as the 9-box grid game. And in the book, it's written with kind of different forms than I use it. And then I've also seen lots of teachers posting about it with other variations. So some teachers don't use dice because it drives them nuts. They use either one set of big foam dice for the entire class, or they just have other modifications. They might do it with small whiteboards. They might do it with a whole group. They might do it with a small group, with partners. There's so many different ways to do it. I give out this template as a piece of paper that students use. You could also do it on the whiteboard. So there's lots of different ways to do it. But the ultimate goal is to have students coming up with sentences and teaching them that they need to provide context in their sentence so that you truly know they understand the meaning of the word. So the word cling. I cling to my mom. Okay, but that doesn't tell me anything about the word. I cling to my mom I cling to my mom as we walk through the haunted house because I'm scared. That gives more context. And so it's helping students understand that they need to provide that context when they're creating sentences, which then in return helps them understand that when they read words, there's context embedded in the text that they're reading that can help them understand the words. I also include sentence frames on my vocabulary word cards that are posted on the wall so that for students who need some support, they have a sentence frame included. And I like to use sentence frames that are cause effect. So that way they're reinforcing that skill too. Because that can be a skill that's difficult to understand. What is the cause? What is the effect? So when I structure my sentence frames with the vocabulary words in them in a cause effect format, one, it lets students bring in a wide variety of contexts and ideas, but it also gives them practice with that cause and effect and a little bit of support for their sentences when they play this game. If they choose not to use the sentence frames, that's totally fine. It just depends on the level of support that they need. The Wall of Fame idea came as a result of hearing such amazing sentences from the dice game. So I bought these clip art voice bubbles and printed them, and I bring them to class blank. And then as students play the game or as we use these words in context, I write down their amazing sentences, and then they sign it and I put it up on the wall, which they're very motivated by. So my sentence frame was, when I am an adult, I would like to acquire ... And I left it open-ended. So Precious said, when I'm an adult, I would like to acquire funding to help a charity for homeless people. George used the same frame. When I'm an adult, I would like to acquire a vehicle so I can go places. With the word devised, Hector wrote, my friend and I devised a plan to save the earth by planting trees. And for the word coerce, again, Hector wrote, bullies coerce kids into doing things for them. And so the sentence frames that I provide kind of elevate the language to be more sophisticated, but the students are truly the ones that are providing the context and the ideas. So I'm giving them a structure, but I'm not limiting the sentence to a particular theme or topic. They're really bringing that in. So one of the words was effort, and my student Ryan talked about how he puts so much effort into reading because he wants to get better at it. And so you really get to know the students, and it's very personalized by giving them a structure, but not keeping it super closed. It's open so that they can bring themselves into it. And then their fabulous ideas are posted on the wall so that they really have that sense of ownership. Something I just recently started this past week is an idea that I got from Twitter. Twitter's amazing. It's basically using vocabulary and playing a game like the game of war. So in the card game of war, each person has, half the deck, and they flip over one card, and then the greater value takes the cards. The vocabulary variation is that each student has a stack of their words and they flip over the top one. And then the challenge is that they have to explain or give a sentence that tells how those words are related to each other. So this sentence here, or this turn here, was avalanche and halt. So then the student could say, if there is an avalanche, climbers will have to halt. And then I was playing with one of my newcomers and she was shuffling her papers and she said, no entiendo. She didn't understand my description. And so I explained in Spanish. And then she would say her ideas in Spanish and I would repeat them in English with the motions. So if she told me something about the avalanche and halt in Spanish, then I'm repeating, if there is an avalanche, then the climbers, they'll have to halt. And so I'm giving those words again and guiding her. I purposely chose to play with her so that I could support her. I also played with another student and we did not come up with a single pair of words where there wasn't a way to connect them. Were sentences like, I went to the section of the store where they have equipment for climbing. Section and equipment were the words. Altitude and tank. When we climbed to a high altitude, we needed a tank of oxygen to breathe better. There were great connections. So this is an activity that really fosters critical thinking and seeing the words connected in the context, because I don't just want students spitting back a memorized definition for a word. I want them to understand the word and how the word fits together in the overall context of the story or the theme or the text that they're reading about. So they can almost weave together this narrative like I did at the beginning of how these words go together. And I even had my fourth graders write stories. I said, here's your 10 words, write a story. And they were so engaged in thinking of this way to tell the story. I mean, and one story was about baseball. That had nothing to do with the actual theme of reading, but he put all these words together in a story about baseball. Another was a story, like a very good informative piece about gymnastics, incorporating the words. Another student wrote about some of the words were racket and blaring and suggested. And she wrote about her neighbor being upset at her brother for blaring his music and it was such a racket. So she suggested the neighbor should move. Really funny, but clever. So this fostering this connection between words is a skill that I find really important, and putting it in a fun game like this keeps students really engaged, but keeps them thinking. Something else I've been doing, which I love, is that I come across our school vocabulary words so often when I'm reading to my own kids. So the first thing I started doing was taking a picture of the page in whatever book I was reading with my daughters, and I would submit it to Seesaw, and I would ask my students, I would put a caption on it, who can find the vocabulary word on this page? And they could type it in and respond to me. Then I started actually printing the pictures and bringing them in so that we could think of it together. The picture of the tank is from the mall, from the Dippin' Dots stand at the mall. And when I showed them that, so many of them had a reaction of, oh, is that the Washington Square Mall? I've been there. And that excitement, because then they make this connection that these words are real life. It's not just about reading class. It's not just about this job that we have to do each week to learn words. It's about these words being words that you can encounter in the real world. We had talked about avalanche, and the context was snow. So I had said it is when the snow falls. And then I was reading Frog and Toad with my girls, and there it is with rocks. And so I brought it in. This is another example or another context for avalanche. So many of the students love the Captain Underpants and Dog Man books. And so when I was reading Captain Underpants with my girls, we came across this illustration where he has his hand out when the burglars are coming out. And I said, what word does that relate to from our vocabulary list? And they said, halt. He's telling them to halt. And then a student said, oh, and what was it? It was a vocabulary word he related to unexpected, which was a word weeks and weeks ago. And he said, oh, it was unexpected. They weren't expecting that Captain Underpants would be there. And so he brought in a word we had done weeks and weeks ago to make another connection, another layer of a connection to this story. And then this Bink and Golly book I was reading with my daughters, and there's this whole scene, several pages, where Golly is imagining that she's climbing. And so it went really well with our theme for that week about climbing. And I brought in several different pictures, and we talked about which picture represented which word. There was approaching, and there was succeed, which we did a little check mark for succeed when she was at the top of the mountain. And then there was halt, where she was kind of hanging off the edge because she had fallen. So many of the words were represented in this book that was totally unrelated to, it was, different context than what we were reading, but yet it shows them that those words are out there, and they've really enjoyed figuring out which words are represented in the illustrations. I also had a picture from Frozen, Elsa and Anna on the boat, because our word was voyage, and the word was not in the text, and they were really thinking. And so it's another good brain challenge. Every week we also play Kahoot as a way to review the words. It's not an assessment, but I do look at the data and kind of see how the students did, because they are playing individually. Most of the questions are closed questions where one vocabulary word will fit in the sentence. And so there's one correct answer and 3 other vocabulary words from the week that do not fit. And we take the time after each question to go over, you get the result of how many students got it right and how many got it wrong. And we go over why the particular answer was correct or not. So it's a teaching opportunity, not just a review game or an assessment. And I always make sure to include questions like this, which are questions where all of the answers are the same vocabulary word, but the endings are different. So that really forces students to think about the structure of the sentence and what words are included that would help them figure out which ending belongs. So the man was the group through the zoo, so they could learn about all the animals. So the clue here, and we've talked about when you have is or was, when the verb comes after that, it has an ing ending. If the sentence happens to have context clues that are past tense, that gives us the idea that we need to have a past tense word with the ed ending. So I challenged them, and over time, we've discussed and they've started to learn of specific clues that they can look for to know when they have to use those particular endings. So it's just another layer to the vocabulary practice. Getting to assessment, we typically assess students with the weekly test that comes with the reading program. This is an example of a question where the correct answer is a word that students would not know. So the vocabulary word that we practiced was rough, but coarse is another word that would not be familiar to students. So unless I specifically taught them the word in order to coach them to get the right answer on the test, they would likely get this answer wrong. So I posted about this at the time with this article from the reading teacher, The Dangers of Test Preparation. If I'm focusing on teaching to the test, is that in the best interest of my students? And I don't think so. Oftentimes they would get answers wrong because the words that are choices are just as complex for them as the words that we've been working on. And so what does that truly tell me about their understanding of the words that we've been practicing? Not much. So we came up with an alternative way to assess students, which is to kind of have them draw upon the different activities that we practice throughout our lesson or our week. They have to draw a pictorial representation, which is what Marzano calls a non-linguistic representation. We've practiced that. They have to use the word in a sentence. We've practiced that. They have to tell what the word means in their own words. We've practiced that. And then they also have to give a synonym, which is hard. So I have altered this assessment to give 3 choices and have them circle the correct one. But between these 2 students, I can see kind of different levels of understanding. On the right, I spotted a spider by my bed and I screamed for help. So great sentence. She has a synonym. She can tell me what it means, and she has a detailed picture. People was sick on the voyage. It's a start, but there's not as much context to it. So it gives me a better indication of what I need to support students with. So rather than multiple choice, you're right or you're wrong, I have all these layers. Can they show me a picture? Does something come to their mind that they could identify as going with that word? Can they specifically tell me what the word means? Can they use it appropriately? Can they give me a word that means something similar? So there's all these different layers that we've practiced that I can then see how they're doing. Sometimes they can get the pictures, but they cannot come up with the word in their the meaning in their own words. So that helps me understand what I need to focus on in my instruction a lot more than a yes or no, whether it was correct or not on the multiple choice test. So yes, this does take a little bit longer to grade. However, the value and the information that I'm getting is so much more than a multiple choice test. And we had students last week do the multiple choice test with partners just to talk it through as kind of just an exercise. And what they were saying and bringing up was so amazing. It was such a good learning tool as opposed to the final be all end all. And then we could use it also as a teaching opportunity. So when they came across something that confused them, rather than saying, sorry, I can't help you, this is a test, I could say, oh, well, remember, we learned that the suffix, the suffix less means without. So if the word is heartless, that means without heart. Okay, well, what does that mean? Literally without a heart? Or what do you think? And discuss it. And so this is actually then the assessment that I give them at the end in order for them to show me what they know. The other important piece is that we strongly advocated that a 1 week time span for a lesson is not enough. And we strongly advocated that ELLs need more time to process. And so rather than now having to cram everything in to 5 days, we've been given the liberty to stretch it out. And so we are able to incorporate more of these activities so that students can really grasp the vocabulary words and understand them more fully than they would if they were given such a short period of time. The resources that I've used for this presentation are included on this slide, as is my contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me. I would be happy to talk with you more about vocabulary instruction. I hope you've enjoyed it.